And we're back. So in this section, we're going to talk about three aspects of the origins of policing in America. The first thing that we'll talk about is slave patrols. What were slave patrols? What were their purpose? The primary functions of slave patrols, and last but not least, the transition to modern day police force. As I did in the last section, I want to begin with a quote. And the quote comes from W.E.B. Du Bois, and it states, "Herein lies the tragedy of the age. Not that men are poor, all men know something of poverty. Not that men are wicked, who is good? Not that men are ignorant, what is the truth? Nay, but men know so little of men." And when we think about the issue of policing in America, and we have many people who have different perspectives on policing, who believe that you're, in terms of Colin Kaepernick, you're disrespecting the flag. Again, this reflects to this particular quote. How little do we know of men? And for many in America, how little do we know about the origins of policing in America and the purpose of America? So when we look at this 5-star and the badge that represents the deputies in the sheriff departments in America, a lot of us don't realize that it comes from the 5-star badge that represented the slave patrols of the South. Origins of police in America. Paddy rollers. That is a term that was used to describe slave patrols. They were used to manage race-based conflicts throughout the South. When we see many movies, it always looks at this wayward African or this wayward African American, this big male was doing something that he wasn't, and it was always fearful. This was the origins of slave patrol. The first formal slave patrol was created in the Carolinas in 1700s, and Samuel Walker describes these patrols as the first publicly funded police departments in the American South. Slave patrols had 3 primary functions. By 1837, the Charleston Police Department had 100 officers, and their primary functions were, 1, to chase down, apprehend, and return their owners' runaway slaves. 2, to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts. And last but not least, 3, to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject to the summary justice outside of the law if they violated any kind of rules and regulations. And again, talking about how little do we know of men, how little do we know of the purpose, and not to equate what we see today in law enforcement to that of the past when it comes to the slave patrols. But what I will say is this: if we don't know our history, many of us will be doomed to repeat it in terms of how we apply justice and policy and all these different things moving forward. The 13th Amendment, I want to talk about that, and in particular, when we think about the 13th Amendment, I want to draw our attention to a movie, a film by Ava DuVernay, 13th, which if you haven't seen, I would advise everyone who's looking at this lecture to take a look at it, because that is a part of the required reading, viewing for this particular section that we're on. All right. When it comes to the early Reconstruction, which was from 1865 to 1877, and when we think about the freeing of the slaves, Reconstruction on the heels of President Abraham Lincoln's death, all these different organizations emerged out of this. The federal militia, state militia, the Ku Klux Klan, all arose from the disbanded slave patrols to preserve the individual society of American citizens and so on and so forth. Ku Klux Klan, for many people, we see this as trauma-inducing, especially African Americans. So these are some of the origins of what was born out of slave patrols, what was born out of the slave revolts, and what was born out of the need to quell the so-called Negro slave. Known for their extreme cruelty and mercilessness, white patrollers controlled the slave population through civil war and were not completely disbanded after slavery ended. the transition of modern slave patrols to modern police force was, historians assert that transition from slave patrols to publicly funded police departments was smooth in the South and the North, while other slave patrols, as first formally recognized undertaking policies in America, were not so smooth. But the fact of the matter is they did happen as a result of states believing that there was a need to deal with the influx of these now free slaves. Newly organized police units adopted three distinct characteristics in terms of how they went about their work. The first was limited police authority. The powers of the police are defined by law. And we're going to talk about how law defines how citizens who were both black and white receive justice in America. Local control, meaning that local governments bear the responsibility for providing police force. And last but not least, fragmented law enforcement. Agencies within these different areas were designed to have specific jurisdiction and specific governing powers. So this is what we see and what we saw in the beginning, and why we see the transition from the slave patrols to the need to establish a more connected or a more established law department. And these are the reference for this particular section. And without further ado, we'll move on to the next section. Thank you.